Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last Contemporary Art Lecture this term. I'm delighted to welcome Jesse Wine, who is going to talk about his work and answer your questions at the end. Just some of his background information. He went to Camberwell and then the Royal College of Art, graduated in 2010. He's had a couple of shows at Lemoncello. He's actually represented by Lemoncello in London and Mary Mary in Glasgow. Some other major shows, Baltic 2014-15, he was in the show there. He's in the British Art Show right now. It's just open in Leeds. He's got a forthcoming show at Tate's in Ives next year. And he's, if I can pronounce this right, he's also got a show at the Gemeente Museum in The Hague next year. Interestingly, he did a ceramics fellowship at Camden Art Centre in 2014. Okay, welcome, Jesse.
Thank you. Is the sound okay before I start? And then it's all annoying. Right, great. Okay, so all of that is true. And I make ceramics, and only ceramics, that's what I do, which has been for the past about 5 years. I've been making only ceramics. And so I just feel like that's worth saying at the beginning, because although ceramics is incredibly trendy, and I'm in part responsible for that, there isn't anyone that I know that only makes ceramics. That's not a claim to originality, that's just a claim about my pursuit. And I can talk more about that, or you can ask questions about that at the end, but I'm just going to go into the talk. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm not necessarily just going to present my art and then kind of talk about why I did things or shows I made. What I want to talk about is, I want to talk about making things. I want to talk about critiquing things, since we're in a college. I want to talk about understanding audiences or predicting understanding audiences. And I want to talk about contextualizing what you do, how you can do that. I'm going to focus on two main examples before I talk about my own work, neither of which are necessarily contemporary art. They're art forms in their own right, but neither of them are art. But the reason that I want to concentrate on these two, they're both pop acts, as in music pop acts. The reason that I want to concentrate on these two is because they're so much more universal than art. And so the conversation that comes from concentrating on these two is a lot broader to begin with, and then I can kind of hopefully sort of bring it back in after that when I talk about my own work. So, what I want to start with is an excerpt from an amazing film called True Stories, which is by Talking Heads, or specifically the lead singer of Talking Heads, David Byrne. The reason that I'm starting with this is because this is in 1986, so it's 3 years after I was born. So it was probably when I was truly forming my consciousness. The second pop example that I'm going to give you is current day. So they're kind of, in a way, bookends my existence thus far, at least. So I'm just going to play it, and then we'll begin to talk about it afterwards. Okay. It's totally an amazing film. I really recommend it. True Stories, it's called, 1986. Okay, so Talking Heads were making pop music in the 70s and the 80s, but at this stage in 1986, to me, it was particularly interesting because I think that, and another scene that I'm going to show you from the film will explain this better, you could really feel changes in the world about to happen, the main change being the internet and the shift of information, how that spread, and the access to information. Okay, and so what I think is really remarkable about this, and this kind of sets up my discussion for today, is that within the act of making creatively, they have the foresight to think in a way that disseminates one's actual, or to make in a way that disseminates one's actual thinking behind the work or a way of working. So what I mean by that is that they are constructing environments into which their art will exist. And I think this is a particularly pertinent scene because the kids are literally dancing with construction material. And previously, the guy with the hard hat is talking to David Byrne, who's wearing the cowboy costume. He is speaking about building things, creating things, making things, and being genuinely imaginative because he's talking about a field and saying, imagine a house, imagine a bathroom here, imagine this here. So what Talking Heads were really completely incredible at is presenting a complete pop product, but the way in which they presented it, the conceit of the way that they presented it, or the conceit of what it was that they did, was that it was a conceptual move. They weren't actually necessarily a pop band. They adopted a pop... This is me prophesizing now, this is not a fact. I think that what Talking Heads did was they generated a context for the pop product they are releasing into the world, making other art forms, predominantly films and things with narrative, to better explain or to encompass, contextualize what it is that they're making. Okay, so the next film I just want to show you is them presenting themselves in a music video. So this music video is again, completely amazing. And you can see in this opening scene, this is where the original iPod advertisement came from. I don't know if anyone remembers that. This original Apple, the advert was people dancing with a colourful background silhouetted in the front. And it's just ripped straight off this Talking Heads video, which is particularly interesting because they were ripping everything off themselves, as you will be able to see in this. Okay. So, within the product, within the video, they are actually being turned into chocolate bars. So, to me, what they're doing is they're presenting themselves as a commodity, very, very directly. And I think that was to do with the feeling they had of producing music in an environment where you're earning money or you're a kind of celebrity, if you like. It becomes your job. And so what this is to do with, what this kind of, this way of working, producing the film previously, and then the video operating like this way, and obviously you can feel it's so dated, it's before copyright of trademarking, because the video's got Heinz ketchup and all the rest of it in it. This is to do with the speed at which they receive feedback at that period in time. Okay, and the really big difference, or maybe the best way to punctuate the difference, is that now we receive feedback immediately through social networking or even email messaging. We're just constantly receiving feedback all the time. We're publishing and receiving feedback. Whereas these guys, they're publishing, but they're not necessarily immediately receiving feedback, which is why these constructs, things like producing a feature film in which you can kind of exist as a pop act, would like operate more successfully, or maybe it's more pertinent with the time at which it's produced. So, to put an end cap on Talking Heads, this is another scene from the film where David Byrne is joining the guy with the hard hat who was talking about the houses at the beginning. He's joining his family for dinner. So they're in Virgil, Texas, and the guy with the hard hat, he has a company called Vericore, which sounds like a Microsoft or an Apple, a kind of future-thinking kind of dot-com boom company. What he's talking about is a prediction of the future. So this is not his prediction of the future, but Talking Heads' prediction of the future, because obviously they wrote the film. And so I'm just going to show the clip, actually, and then I'll talk about it afterwards. So they are not only contextualizing the world into which their product would be released at the time of it being made, but they're also predicting the future into which their product will remain, which to me is obviously super, super fascinating, because really that's not, to me it's almost like a paranoia of sorts, almost kind of trying to second guess, not what will just happen to the world, but what will happen to your art once the world has changed. And this is something that I think about all the time. I'm thinking about the audience, and I'm thinking about responding in some way, which is why it's incredibly interesting to me. So now we are here in the future. I've written that down. So now we are here in the future. And we can talk about those new inventions, because what he was prophesizing about really did happen. And the impact on how we make, think, and the criteria for success has completely changed since then, to now. It's just a completely different world altogether. So in order to kind of like better explain that, I want to like bring the kind of what I'm talking about up to date, and I want to show a video by Drake, which is a recent song, I'm sure you all know it, called Hotline Bling. And what was really interesting about Hotline Bling initially was that it was released, I think, at the beginning of this year, didn't get that much success, and then slowly over the year in the States, it built up momentum, and finally he released a video with it. So the video is made retrospective of the song, And in a way, like, I think that allows like a conceptual positioning from the artist. And I think this is what Drake, as an artist, does really well. He's a wonderful curator. I don't think he's a very gifted maker. I don't think he's a very gifted musician. But he's incredible about bringing new teams of people together to produce new products all the time. OK, so I'm going to show you this one next. OK, so as soon as this video came out, of course, he just gets completely slammed in the press with this immediate feedback. Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, immediate feedback, totally slammed everyone. He's a bad dancer, he's this, he's that, he's whatever. But I don't believe that that's what's happening. What he's doing is he's actually providing a platform for you to complete his work on. So he is also contextualizing his work, but in a different way. So I'm just going to read something that I've written down because I think I wrote it quite well. So Drake is in a blank space performing repetitious, suggestive dance moves. Instead of generating the context for us to consider his art in, he is giving it up, allowing us as a viewer to generate this for ourselves. This is about the shift in speed of feedback. There is immediate media storm because of the possibility of what he is offering us. So the big shift is that instead of providing a context product explanation, as with Talking Heads, Drake is providing us with the opportunity to finish his work for him, which allows the possibility of personal communication between him and you. So what I mean is, immediately after this video came out, there was tons of
going places where you don't belong. Bitch, try me, bitch. I know when that hotline blink, that can only mean one thing.
Must have bombed this master hill.
I really hope you play this, cause oh girl, you test my patience with all these seductive photographs. I'm a scat man. And I know when that hotline blink,
This is amazing. This is so amazing.
that can only mean one thing.
That one. I think he predicted that. I think he predicted that this is, in fact, exactly what would happen. Not this one, because it's so much more abstract. But I think that he actually predicted that last one. Okay.
I would just much rather give you a
I have to stop it, otherwise. And so what he's doing is he's also accessing a kind of personal experience or relationship with you in the same way that Talking Heads maybe show you like a bottle of Old Spice or a can of Coke, and then immediately your relationship with that object is presented back to you. He's doing the same thing because he's giving you the opportunity to use something that is most likely in your pocket, your phone, to produce your own version of what he's doing. So you can actually have a personal relationship with him, with his work. So it's quite a difficult argument to make in a way, because what he's doing is he's crucially leaving something for himself by opening this process up. Because once you've made the thing, then he watches the thing back. So he has information to creatively move forward, to continue imagining and build up more of a sort of like facility for prediction of the way we behave, the way we respond to him as an artist, as a musician. And I think that in this video, and this, forgive me if this sounds like really, really crass, because I don't mean it to sound really crass, but I think he uses the women in the video particularly as props. And I don't mean that women are props. What I mean is that when we see the video and when we see those women, we immediately associate that sound of music with this kind of objectification and even misogyny. And so it becomes convincing. I'm not saying it's okay to do this. I'm just saying that it's crucial to the product operating successfully for him is that it's convincing. And those kinds of triggers are what make it convincing. So it's the consideration of the audience in relation to how something is made, but it not being to the detriment of the product. That would be the kind of task at hand. Okay. So now I'm going to make a big jump, which is really difficult to make, but I feel like this is appropriate to show Talking Heads to mark like the beginning of my life, and then to show this Drake kind of moment which marks this year, and then talk about the way that I'm thinking, in a way in relation to these things, but mainly in relation to the world and in relation to producing things. So the problem with this is that you run the risk of not being as entertaining as video, which is likely to happen probably, because it's absolutely amazing watching stuff on the internet, as we all know. Okay, lights off. So, my explanation for this, in relation to the way that I produce work, is in the way that I fabricate exhibitions. So, this is an exhibition at the Baltic, which was spoken about at the beginning. And the reason this exhibition looks the way it is and operates the way it does and was the way it was is because on a site visit to the Baltic, which is in Newcastle, I spent about 35 minutes in the gallery. And during that time, more than half of the people that came into the space, numbers-wise, were children from primary schools. And I wasn't told this before I'd gone, that it was a real popular schools destination or anything like that. But what I realized was that I was actually making art for a new audience. Because the audience that I'm familiar with here in London or in New York or, different places in Europe, it's this kind of mature art audience. Everyone's been to art school. Everyone knows what you're talking about. You can, drop a Duchamp reference in somewhere and people don't even bat an eyelid. They're like, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. But the point of the way that this exhibition needed to operate, or I felt like it needed to operate, is to a truly new audience. These people have never, ever, ever seen your art before. They do really want to see it and they do really want to experience it. But how are they going to do that? How can you predict what they're going to do? And how can you work with them in order for them to, in a way, enjoy it or at least have some kind of emotional experience of what it is that they're looking at? One of the really crucial things about this is that when I went to visit the Baltic, in this same space, there was a very stiff, abstract, expressionist sculpture show, by which I mean big blobs of plaster with not kind of much going on. There wasn't like a great degree of generosity or clarity in the work. It required you to really search for something in the art. And so all of these things led me to believe that what I wanted to do was make a show that was A, aimed at children, B, really entertaining, C, had a narrative, and lastly, it was to be really, really generous so that people would completely partake in the work. So what I ended up doing was, also because it was my first institutional exhibition, or solo exhibition, I decided that I was going to do a really super autobiographical exhibition about myself and about my life, and tried to give like a fair presentation of who I am, almost as a kind of like presenting myself to a kind of like a broader world, if you like, because the art world's tiny and the whole world is out there and it's much more interesting, basically. So I made these 3 giant portraits, each on a plinth, and each having a different behavior in a different environment. So the one in the foreground is, the show was called Young Man Red, which is what someone once called me. So Young Man Red in the studio, Young Man Red eating dinner at the back, and Young Man Red at home on the right-hand side. So there's just these kind of simple triggers within the work. All of the work was completely scaled up for this exhibition, which is something I'm not a fan of doing, or at least wasn't a fan of doing. But, crucially, because it was for kids, it became this really great, simple trick. Children love things that are either absolutely tiny or completely enormous. That's a fact about the world somehow. It's completely entertaining for children that there would be much bigger. So there was kind of a loophole in making there, which I hadn't had the opportunity to access before, and so I totally took it. So this is it's roughly as tall as the top of the screen. The metal bar is about as tall as the top of the screen, so it's really giant work. And these works operate like puppets, basically, which I also thought would resonate kind of, or align itself with children's entertainment in relation to puppetry being this ancient form of successful kids' entertainment that still exists today, amazingly, even with Instagram and iPhones and iPads. These are a series of works. This is, this off the plinth, which was called Young Man Red eating dinner, or at home. Eating dinner. And so, so they're these really large-scale, in a way, like consciously sort of pretentious objects, like these Duralex glasses that, you get your flat white in, and the wine bottle less so. This is in the studio, so that on the left-hand side you can see 2 bags of clay, and then this is a half-finished pot, so it's kind of like being taken from the clay. And then this is like kind of a typical work of mine. And then here you have like these different clay tools. I'll show you close-ups in a minute, and a rolling pin. And then the outfit itself, which is me, is stuff that I wear in the studio: red gilet, shorts, and these Adidas shoes or a pair of Reeboks. And so, yeah, as I say, I really wanted to give this kind of like flat, clear presentation of what I do and why I do it. And part of that was to do with the fact that the money for this exhibition is coming from taxpayers. You know, it's a public institution, and so when I received the budget to do it, which was like much bigger than any budget I'd had before, I really felt this kind of compulsion to, in a way, like respond as directly as possible to the people that would encounter the exhibition. Really give them something to get their teeth into and to kind of definitively understand. I think it's quite clear, and the description of the show is incredibly clear as well. I'm just going to flick through images then quickly. This is like a half-finished work of art. These are tools that I use in the studio. This is me at home with different Reebok classics. So it's this kind of horrendously British kind of idea about identity and how Reebok classics are incredibly British. And then also a football, you can see on the far side of the plinth there, which was right near the door as you came in, and was completely conscious of, and I'm completely conscious of the fact that in Newcastle, where the show was, there's this massive football following. And so really as a trigger or as a prop, in a way what I was talking about with Drake and the girls in the video, this kind of idea that if you see something you know or that you kind of feel you can associate with, have a relationship with already, it makes it a hell of a lot easier to understand other things around it. Because already you have a way in, you have a form of understanding, something that you have a relationship with outside of the experience that you're seeing in front of you. These are the shoes. Yeah, that's the football. And then this is a close-up of the work. So this is the second room of the exhibition. So the first room was really this kind of like presentation about me. This is who I am. This is the way I work. This is me in the studio. This is me at home. This is me eating. These kind of really banal, boring situations. And then the second room was a room of copies of works of art of other people. So the first room was supposed to be a kind of like an exercise in this is how I make, and this is what I look like, and this is how I do it, and then or where I do it. And then this was kind of like the inspiration room, if you like. These are the people I look at. These are the influences I have. And part of the reason this was really important is because I made 5 copies of different artists' work. I'm going to show you. There's one of them. This guy called Rudy Ortio. None of these artists are have ever had public institution shows in the UK. So truly no one really would know who they are if they weren't from an art background. So to me it was incredibly crucial to kind of like give this as evidence behind what they see in the room next door. And maybe in a way it is a little bit like what I've just done that's just come to me, with Talking Heads and with Drake, this kind of like bringing you up to date or taking you back in order to provide enough context for you to understand what's happening in the other room. So, yeah, that's by a guy called Rudy Ortio. This is by a guy, or not by a guy, they're by me, but they're copies of other people's work. This is a guy called Ken Price. He's an amazing American ceramicist, West Coast. And then this is a guy called Peter Volkos, who was also a West Coast American ceramicist. And so, yeah, so this room was kind of a history of, if you like. This next show that I want to show you is, and I don't want to do a list of shows, I'm just trying to show you ideas that best punctuate what it is I'm trying to talk about. So this next show is called Practice of the Wild, and it was at Limoncello. It was my first show. That was in 2012. And what had become apparent to me, and it's still apparent, completely apparent, but it's something I'm less anxious about, was that the speed at which we encounter and judge, if you like, art, whether we like it, whether we don't like it, is incredibly quick, and it's getting quicker. So this is probably conditioned by something like Instagram, because we can take our phones out of our pockets and we can see a picture of someone's dinner, a picture of someone doing yoga, a picture of someone lifting weights, a picture of some incredible landscape and loads of comments saying, where is it? Where are you? Underneath. All this. And what we do in our brains, amazingly, is we can actually build links between these things, which to me is completely remarkable because they're totally disparate. Of course there is information where the person is, who the person is, and you come to kind of expect people to post certain things, for example. But what's amazing is we just flick through them at this hyper speed. And in fact, the ones that we stop on are not the most astonishing images. they're most often probably the ones that you have like the closest relationship to, or something like that, or your ex-girlfriend or something like this, and you're like, oh God, So the criteria for which like we judge things or think about things is completely warped, and that totally comes into the way that we encounter contemporary art. So when I made this show, I'd become totally really anxious that I wasn't going to have an art career, basically. And so I was thinking about ways of slowing people down when they encounter my art. And I kind of came up with this thing in my head, which was that if you can turn the obligatory 3 seconds with which someone uses their brain to look at your art into 30 seconds, then maybe you're going to have a career. Maybe it's going to be incredible. Maybe the people are going to realize the work's totally fucking remarkable and they've never seen anything like it. And of course, that's not like really the case. But I think there's something about learning how to do that is really, really important. And that's probably called exhibition making. How to keep people in a room for a long period of time and how to direct them intelligently. So the idea that I came up with for that, to kind of engage with this, was to make a Zen garden in the gallery. And the reason that I wanted to make a Zen garden was because when you're in a Zen garden, there's 2 things that happen. You act in this default, respectful way. So what you might do is you might put your hands behind your back really quickly. It's a bit like being in a graveyard. You put your hands behind your back very quickly, especially if you're Western at least. You'd put your hands behind your back very quickly. And then you would very slowly, in a kind of solemn way, walk around the outside of the exhibition. So really, all of this, the Zen garden, is just a device to get people to behave in a particular way so that they see each work from every angle and spend probably about 40, 50 seconds walking around the outside of it because you do an obligatory pause at one point, or you kind of get your phone out your pocket and look at something. And this kind of slowdown really works in your favor as an artist because it just gives people a little bit longer to think. And when people have a little bit longer to think, they can make bigger assumptions and kind of maybe explore the work a little more or explore the exhibition a little more. So these kind of devices, in order to like have your work experienced more, became really, really important and kind of crucial to the way that I was working at the time. And so I'm just going to show you, I think, one more show after this one. So this was a show that I did last year at Mary Mary in Glasgow. And so this exhibition, again, what I was trying to do, or the kind of remit I set for myself, slightly different, was to use these large plinths that were difficult to get around and kind of like made you pause or behave in certain ways, or if there was anyone else in the room, you'd be sort of respectful and you'd let them pass. So all of this kind of like body language just gives the work a little bit longer. All that stuff, you get people down a narrow alleyway and they get locked in the corner because it's a bit rude to interrupt someone's conversation or whatever to get back out. And so conceptually, the way that I wanted to deal with that in this show is this is the vantage point that you have as you enter the show. And those 2 gold pots that you see right in front of you, they were total props. They were not works of art. What those works were doing was convincing you that the rest of everything you saw was true, was real, was some kind of artifact, was in some way ancient or new or had a narrative. But these 2 pots, I'm not saying that they were successful, but what they were there to do was to convince you that everything else that you saw was real. And the way in which I wanted to do that was to give these objects a really familiar form. They are big, massive pots that you can imagine being on a cauldron 300 years ago with like a dead animal poking out the top of it, or, this kind of, like ancient but very serious feeling. That's what I wanted these works to do. And so, that word's really crucial, prop. And and it comes back to the Drake thing, and it comes back to the previous show with the way that the show was set up, the Zen garden itself being a prop. So I'm going to take you through the show just briefly. And what that does is that generates enough kind of space for you to operate almost kind of freely beyond that. Because if you find, I just saw someone, in fact, a minute ago, I went to see someone in one of the studios here, and we were speaking about trying to generate enough freedom for yourself to completely express yourself. You actually need to find constructs. And they could be physical constructs, such as plinths, but they can also be conceptual constructs that allow the other works in the show to operate in a way that's kind of, in a way, independent. So what that built up to, in the first room, you saw these works, in particular the gold ones. And then in the second room, you saw these works. And this came from an experience that I had at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where you go from the Roman and Grecian section of the museum, and from that section where they're kind of like really striving for perfection, they're really striving to not see the human's hand in production. They're really looking at materials that you can't, kind of like bronze and this kind of thing. You go from that area of the museum, which is what these gold pots were kind of representative of, literally straight in to the African wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is possibly the most visually engaging, incredible room of art you could ever imagine. These giant, wooden, crazy structures that are all about the person that made them, all about the individual having an idea and executing it. And what was amazing to me was that because of the setting and because of the history, it's completely convincing in the Met. But if you actually break it down, human behavior, human habit, the times at which these things happen, they're not that, probably like in the hundreds of years, and the geography of where they happen, they're not that distant from one another. But crucially, in that environment, we completely participate with it as like the history of civilization. And so what I wanted to do in the show is I wanted to have those gold pots operate as these kind of props, and some of the other works in that first room operate as props, in order for this second room to have this much more kind of gnarled, idiosyncratic feeling. And what I did was I gave myself the same amount of material to make and the same remit to make 2 sets of 4 works. So they were lined up against each other. You can see the first room through there. So these are the works. The works were made, with roughly the same amount of material, the same firing process, the same glazes, everything the same. But what I really crucially wanted to do is I wanted to make each work completely different. The only remit that each work had on this side was that they had to be a head. So this is number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. So I use just to talk technically for a second, in case anyone wants to hear about that, I once fire, which is really crucial to the way that the work forms itself, because it collapses on itself a lot. Once firing means that you don't biscuit fire the clay. You just paint the glaze straight onto the clay. I think it's called greenware, and then you fire that. What happens when you do that is you see this area of the work. It's actually completely sunken into it. So the work begins to collapse and animate itself in the kiln. And I think that when you're making figurative art, such as these heads, that becomes really, really crucial for these kind of things to happen. So it actually does obtain a personality beyond the artist in the process of it actually being produced. For example, this one, it had a low-fire clay in the eyes. So when it went into the kiln, it was a solid object. But when it came out, these eyes had appeared because they'd melted, and that's what you can see running down the face, the side of it there. The second set, on the opposite side, the only remit these had was that they must be pots, and they were going to have belts around the top of them. So you can see the belt running around the top of it there, which is also ceramic. The reason that they had belts around the top of them was because at the time I was going through a few sort of personal crises, and one of them was finding a belt. No, it wasn't. And so, I was going through a number of really big personal issues, and I got depressed. And I didn't think I was the kind of person that would ever get depressed, but it's sort of something that I've been grappling with a little bit in a way. And crucially, something that I really needed to do, because making art is my job, I needed for that to come out in the art. Not as in my art is all depressed, but that I would actually kind of explore what it is to be depressed and in some way engage with it and hopefully disseminate to myself why I'm depressed and kind of deal with it. And so what happened initially, in fact, I've got this the wrong way around because they're those gold pots. So what happened initially was that I started making these plates of food, which was food that I was eating. So I made this work after I'd eaten, mackerel the night before, let's say, or something. And so what I was really doing was I was just showing back to myself that I am me, and that there's no denying it. This is me, this is my life, this is what I'm doing, and I'm going to actually force that to be part of the work. No matter how boring it is. Because at this time, when you're feeling like shit, but you need to make loads of art, you're not thinking about anyone else. You're just thinking about how shit you feel. And so for that to be kind of exercised and dealt with within the work was incredibly important for me. The second reason that's incredibly important is because with clay, it's such an emotional material. When it's in your hand, it is really directly responding to you, the way you touch, the mood you're in. And you can feel that the works, like the works that I made when I was feeling like shit, they all sink down. They're all lower like this. They're actually lower like this. And the works when I'm really happy are like that. So the clay really does respond almost spiritually to the way that you are behaving around it. So it became a really good way of kind of exercising out these issues through the work. So these are the belt pots. And then these are the props from the first room. And they're glazed in this way that is incredibly kind of gross. And it's a shop-bought glaze. It's not one that I've mixed. So it's just a solid colour bought from a shop. And it's a form that I borrowed from another culture. And I've just whacked them together and put it on the plinth, trying to be as direct as possible and suggest that an artist didn't really make this. This just came from the history of the world, history of civilization. And then, like I said, these food plates. This is another food plate. And at this moment, I also started making a number of self-portraits, which, of course, all works of art that an artist makes are in one way or another self-portrait or telling of a time at which it was made, at least. But I actually started consciously making self-portraits with a ridiculous hipster beanie, which I wear, I'm totally guilty of, and, with my ginger hair in it, and just kind of really trying to kind of... This sounds so totally ridiculously cheesy, but I think when you're in a studio for like 10 hours a day on your own, there's greater possibility of being cheesy or behaving in ridiculous ways, because all you have is yourself right in front of you, and so there's no one saying, like, it's a bit cheesy, probably wouldn't do that. So these kind of behaviours, they emerge a little more naturally. And actually, I think they're the ones where you really learn the most, because they're probably the most natural behaviours, because they're the ones that you really want to deny and then bottle back up. And so I made this series of self-portraits, which also really, really helped me to exercise out of these feelings. And I think that's just something worth kind of saying, and I don't mean that as like a finger wagging, I'm wiser than you guys because I'm like older or like done some art shows. I just mean it as like something that you shouldn't be afraid of, because if you're really serious about producing art, then it is going to take up most of your time, and it is something that can kind of like inform your habits as a human, can form, not conform, can form your habits as a human in a kind of really constructive, amazing way that helps you. I mean, it's dangerous, and of course, notoriously, so many artists or creative people are depressed because they're pouring so much out and maybe not receiving as much as they need to kind of like nourish themselves. But I think it's worth saying and kind of facing it kind of flat on, basically. So these works are just called Jessie, and they're self-portraits. And then there's one more here, which was for a show in Rome. This was actually the first one I made, and was super charming and amazing. And I had my tongue out. And I think that's like, in a way, that's like a resistance to the idea that it's cheesy. I would have my tongue out almost to kind of acknowledge the fact that I know it's cheesy to the audience who's looking at it by sticking my tongue out. But actually, the point is not the tongue. The point is the gesture of making it and having the confidence to make it. Okay, I'm not gonna really go on. If anyone wants to ask technical questions or whatever, they're totally welcome to do that. I'm just not all that interested in it. I just prefer to kind of think about context and stuff of where the work exists. So what I'm going to do is, this is the last image I'll show you. This is an image from Frieze Sculpture Park, which is a ridiculous pursuit because it lasts 4 days and so much money and effort goes into it, and it's just a bit of a retarded situation, I think. But this is the most recent work of art that I've made and shown, and I think you're only as good as your last gig, especially if you're like young-ish and you're kind of like in the process of learning and making at the same time. So this is a work called "Let Me Entertain You," after the Robbie Williams song, which titles are something I use if the work is not necessarily British, like a Reebok classic. Titles are often something I use to kind of locate the work to me and like in a way where I'm from. So an example of another title of work is "Well Nice, full stop, proper nice," which is what I heard this lad describe a pair of trainers to another lad as. Well nice, proper nice. Which is a really beautiful sentence, or two sentences, but also just undeniably British, to me, at least. And so, so Let Me Entertain You was kind of a tongue-in-cheek critique of the fact that in 4 days, this kind of ridiculous circus-style form of entertainment takes place in Regent's Park for for all these people. But actually, the people that spend most time with it are squirrels and pigeons out there, you know, and it's raining. But yeah, in a way, I'm showing you this work to kind of open up a conversation because I'm not actually sure it's that good. I think it was quite interesting and it responded to the environment it was in. But compared to somewhere like the Baltic or to the gallery, where you're sort of like maybe more familiar with the environment, or not more familiar, but you're more familiar with the context of a white cube. This is a bit more difficult, just out in the public. And have always wanted to make public art, and I think public art in this country is worryingly bad, like alarmingly bad. And I actually just started to make a commissioned work, and I realised why it's so bad. And the reason it's so bad is because the number of people in middle management that get involved in the creative process that the artist is undertaking is fucking nuts. There's like 10 different people asking you questions about, you know, like, well, what if a kid throws a football at it? What then? You know, like, and this kind of thing, this shouldn't inform like the way you make something or why you make something. This should inform their decision of who they select to make this thing. And so, in a way, this work operates like partly in line with that, in the respect that I sort of like made the clay really thick and was really aware that someone might want to come up to it and kick it, or I don't know, like ride their bike into it or something. But at the same time, like the conceit of it was that I just didn't understand the environment it was going into, and I didn't know the environment it was going into. And so one of the ways that I tried to deal with that is this work is rusted, which is like an old theatrical trick where you use iron filings. And what happens is when the rusted work, for example, when it gets rained on, it will go really dark red, or when the sun's out, it will dry out and become really bright orange. And so what I wanted to do by doing that was to kind of give the work, almost like the way that when the other works that I showed you are fired in the kiln, they animate themselves, they respond to the environment they're in during this firing process. This work would also respond to the environment it's in, and not via me as artist, but via the surface of the material. And of course I've applied the material, but the point is that you cannot control specifically the way in which it behaves. So yeah, it's trying to install a kind of like form of independence within the work of art. So I'm going to stop talking, but so this is the last thing I made, and yeah, if you want to ask questions, great.
Hi, there's such massive lumps of clay. How do they not blow up in the kiln?
They don't blow up because ceramic technicians are liars. That's why, genuinely.
So big lumps don't blow up?
Not really. They're not solid. They're like about this thick. But this is when I was at art school, I decided that I wasn't going to use any techniques which involved technicians, because technicians often don't want to put the effort in. There are some technicians that are amazing, but if it means them operating beyond their remit, often they won't do it. And so if you rely on a technician to help you with any of your work, I saw it as you being like fucked. Well, you're fucked. You can't make your work. You need someone else to make it for you, or with you. Not for you, with you. And so I decided that I would just never use... Now, of course, I use a process, the kiln. But it's not true. You can literally put two pieces of clay like this together, make sure it's well dried, and it will fire fine. It's not a problem. Fire it slow. That's all.
Great.
So be confident with it. Be really confident with the material.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just shout.
What was the response like to your Liverpool one with the self-portraits? Did it engender a participatory atmosphere?
With the self-portraits?
Yes.
I couldn't say specifically about the self-portraits because the self-portraits didn't exist alone. They existed alongside lots of other works. But I do think that when you read the title, or I do feel like, having had a number of conversations about them, when people read the title and they say it's just like called your name, and then they look at it and they're like, all right, it's a self-portrait. I think that there is a kind of, there is a really easy conversation to be had there, which is really crucial, because if there's an easy conversation to be had, that opens it up for more difficult conversations as well. So in a way, it's like this, like you make some art that operates really fast, and people are like, yeah, get it. And then you make other work which goes much, much slower, and people are like, right, okay. But if you can have that conversation about the fast one, then I think it makes it a little more easier or accessible for the slower one. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that kind of, it's very divisive.
Hi, God, this is all. I now blanked. Yeah, I was wondering what you were making before you started making ceramics, and whether the conversation about David Byrne and Drake and like participation and audience participation in work came about because you started making products so outright.
Before I was basically like typical multidisciplinary artist making video, photography, and sculpture. Yeah, I think that's like a pretty accurate observation in a way that when you become really focused, like you turn up to the studio and you know that all you're going to make is ceramics. It does free your brain up in a way to think about the kind of, I don't know, like the paraphernalia around that. It definitely does free your brain up, and it does generate more space in a way. Because instead of I think that one of the problems I had as a multidisciplinary artist was that I was like really almost like aggressively trying to kind of get things into the art, if that makes any sense. Like I really want that feeling when you go bowling in the art. So I'll be like trying to get that. It's impossible. It's totally impossible. It's really, really difficult. But when you remove that kind of possibility in a way, I mean, and I'm talking physically more than conceptually now. When you remove that possibility, it does free your brain up in quite an amazing way, I think. And I remember the feeling I had when I started only making ceramics, even though it was like a conceptual decision to do it, to focus and really become good at one thing, hopefully. I remember this feeling of like, fuck, I always worried that I would be a boring artist, and now I am one. I really felt that, like, I've just given up on all that other interesting stuff. But actually, the freedom that is generated from just working in this one way, I mean, it's a broad way. You can do it many different ways, and I try to do it as different as possible all the time. The freedom that is generated from that was actually like stratospheric. I didn't realise that at all. Trial and error, like figuring it out, basically. Yeah.
There's a question there.
Hello. How tall is that piece?
That is 455, I think. So, almost 5 meters tall.
And my question is just how you stack them together, or were they placed upon a pole?
They're on a kebab. Yeah.
And how did you make it so that the ones at the bottom aren't crushed by the weight of the
Because in between like each 3 or 4, there's a plate, basically a metal plate that sits onto the kebab, so it's like that. So then,
that would take away.
So yeah, and then crucially, the one that the plate sits, the one that sits above the plate is a particularly strong one. So you know that the one that's getting most of the pressure isn't that bad. But do you know what? You could do that without the plates, and it wouldn't break. The clay is ridiculously strong. It's high fired and it's really strong. I don't think it would break. The only way it would break is if someone kicked it or really adverse weather conditions.
And
Yeah.
One other technical question was, you were talking about firing the faces in the kiln with the glazes in, and you said the eyes were made with a
Low fire clay.
clay.
So brick, for example, is a low fire clay. It's fired at 900 degrees. I'm not sure that if it... Say that again?
It just disappears.
Well, no, what it does is it actually turns into what looks like a glaze. So basically anything will burn or it will melt and then kind of evaporate. So that clay actually was from Sardinia, and it's really difficult to get in the UK. Annoyingly, because I've tried to get some before. But there's a number of Italian clays that melt at around like 1100 degrees or even lower. And so I was using them as kind of glazes almost in the work, so that the work would go in, as I say, solid and come out with these kind of pools running down it. Yeah.
So you really briefly kind of mentioned this self-awareness of being participating and also being partly responsible for this quite trendy movement with which you're working within. And I think my question is, do you feel vulnerable working within such a kind of trend? And also, do you feel you're slightly responsible for the great pottery throwdown?
Do you know what? I don't think I am responsible, but in any way responsible for the Great Pottery Throwdown. I think that's an anxiety. I think that's an anxiety that British people have begun to feel about like lost languages of trade and how this country used to be an amazing place of industry, and it absolutely isn't anymore. There's an amazing number of people doing throwing classes, just as a hobby. Weaving classes, like a lot of things that this country was really known for doing. I don't think you can put that down to contemporary art. Contemporary art is actually a microcosm within culture. The second thing about the like hipster ceramic thing is, in a way you do feel vulnerable because everything that I make is like going to a show. You know what I mean? Like you look in the studio and like, well, that's going there and that's going there and this is going there. That's not a very healthy way of working, but it's a really addictive way of working because you become so like desired that, of course, that's like that's just unhealthy, obviously. And so I've been trying to like practice my way out of that recently, in fact, and that's been really, really healthy. And I've totally made like the best, what I think is probably the most interesting work I've made for a while because I've been consciously practicing out of it. But I do think. I don't feel vulnerable in the respect that, like, when it moves from ceramics to stained glass or to, I don't know, like process-driven video or whatever it might move to next, contemporary art, as it's like, baby. I'm not suddenly going to go and buy a video camera and have a massive whitey about how, that's not going to happen. I've like totally found the material that I will, I think, always work in. I would actually like to make other stuff. I would like to make video, which now sounds like I'm a hypocrite, but it's not. That's not relative to an anxiety about being like a hipster. I am in some way responsible for the cool hipster ceramic art movement. There's probably about 100 artists that are responsible for it, and I'm one of them. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, pleasure.